start off this international conference on India and Europe, we begin with the topic of the spread of the laws on caste beyond India, that is into a different country, into the United Kingdom, and also into different international organizations, including the EU, the European Union, as well as the United Nations. We all know and understand that the system of caste and discrimination on the basis of caste was and even today continues to be a social evil. Accordingly, in India, to tackle this discrimination and bring about equality in society, a system of laws and caste, such as affirmative action, has been introduced to bring equality in society. Today, more than 70 years later, we live in an era of globalization, where millions of people have migrated and settled in different parts of the world. As a result, we see an exchange of culture, traditions, practices, languages, and also, in some cases, laws. In this context, this seminar will explore how the laws on caste have gone beyond India at the international level, and the results and the consequences of the spread of laws on caste. To chair the discussion today, we have our own Professor Mahesh Chandra Nayak. With over 18 years of experience in teaching, Professor Mahesh Chandra Nayak is the head of the Department of Law at SDM Law College. He specializes in multiple subjects which include contract law, administrative law, labor laws, and many others. It will indeed be interesting to hear Professor Mahesh Chandra Nayak's sir's views on this particular topic today. To lead the discussion today, we have as our resource person, Dr. Prakash Shah, Reader in Law and Culture from the Queen Mary University of London. A brief introduction of Dr. Shah. He's had a stellar academic career with an LLB and LLM from LSE in London. He went on to pursue his PhD from SOAS, London, on studentship. He has authored several books and articles, mostly on law, cultural diversity, Asian studies, and migration and asylum. His current research project on the foundations of caste system in India and beyond India is closely related to this session's topic. In his talk, he will argue how the laws on caste have spread to the United Kingdom through the Equality Act of 2010. Following this, he will also examine how similar provisions have made their way into regional and international organizations such as the European Union and United Nations. To conclude, he will discuss the response of the laws of caste by the Indian diaspora in the UK. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Prakash Shah, Dr. Prakash Shah, to lead the session.
I'll put my Gujarati hat on for a second, and thank you to Sumit Bhai. It's nice to see you again. Actually, Sumit Bhai has been a sort of a regular feature of Queen Mary, where I teach, for the last few months, and we kept missing each other, and it's kind of it's funny and nice at the same time that we kept emailing each other for the meeting that we never had. And now finally we are meeting, and it's a nice surprise to see that you're introducing this session. So, Sumit Bhai has also told you something about my title and a little bit about the topic that I want to speak about. I will deviate slightly, as you know, I'm probably not a very disciplined speaker in that sense, right? So I will, and of course, you know, there's this pressure. You know, when somebody asks you for a title, you give something. And then they say, oh, can you give us an abstract as well? Then you give something as an abstract. And then you think, oh, perhaps I should talk about something else as well, you know, because that's missing, or perhaps that seems more important or current or something. One of the qualifiers I have from the title is that, of course, our title refers to the spread of laws beyond India to the international sphere, the EU, the UK, and so on, which is also very deeply connected with the aim of the project. Now, in fact, over the next 2 days, we will get more opportunity to speak about that. I will mention some of that, some of those issues today as well, just now. But in tomorrow's sessions, I think we can go deeper into some of those dimensions, because I think you will see them popping up again and again and again. But in different ways, right? So we'll try to really unpeel this onion and see what's really at the heart of it, right? Today, it's a commonplace, right, that Indians have a hierarchical, oppressive caste system, inspired and sanctioned by the Hindu religion, and that neither earlier reformers nor layer upon layer of laws, including the Indian constitution, have managed to rid India of that system. If laws enacted since the colonial period appear not to be achieving their intended aim, ideally an eradication of caste or its disadvantages, one might expect a reasonable response to include a re-evaluation of the basic assumptions of the idea of the caste system, which underlies the legal framework in India. However, you don't see that happening. Instead, what we see is that the existing laws on caste atrocities and caste-based reservations for jobs, university places, are regularly expanded in India. With some exceptions, politicians do not dare to argue for a lowering or abandonment of caste-based reservations, effectively a type of quota system for different caste groups. That is despite its widely reported dysfunctional effects and consequent dissatisfaction within the wider society. Candidates for university places and jobs do not compete on merit, and entry standards are often radically asymmetrical as between beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries. Rather, campaigns for inclusion into the quota system often arise, accompanied by public unrest and violence, as seen recently in Gujarat, Haryana, and also most recently in Maharashtra. I don't know if there's been a more recent incident somewhere in India about that, but we can keep listing them, I'm sure. As for the Indian caste atrocities legislation, the Protection of Civil Rights Act 1955 and the Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989, only members of one of the listed scheduled castes and scheduled tribes can be victims. Given the background assumption that the caste system targets those putatively lowest in its scale, it might be surprising to learn, as our friends Duncan Jalki and Sophia Patan have recently shown, that crime statistics do not bear out that assumption. In fact, they point to the politically incorrect conclusion that members of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are less likely to be victims of caste atrocities. I hope I've got that right, because please correct me in one of the other sessions if that's not an appropriate summary of your research. But in fact, this refers to the chapter of Duncan and Sophia Ji in the book that we were just talking about. The older writing on the relationship between caste and law, notably by Mark Galanter in India, is somewhat unreadable and now well out of date. Although much important research remains to be conducted on India, and not least the frozen and unsatisfactory nature of the conventional assumptions about the caste system and the implications for the Indian legal system, the focus of the present discussion is not on India directly. While the caste system has long been associated with India, or broadly South Asia, and with Hinduism, it is striking how debates on caste have been transplanted to some of the places where the Indian diaspora has become established. This is especially so in the United States and the United Kingdom. Conversely, it should be striking too how the issue of caste is hardly raised as a matter of public policy in other places where significant Indian diasporas are also present, especially in Asia, Africa, or the Caribbean region. Although the job is not taken up by me here today, it would be important to research why it is that caste discrimination issues are not raised in the rest of Asia. For example, in Singapore, Malaysia, Fiji, etc., with their sizable Indian communities. Or in places in Asia where the Indian influence is regarded as historically significant, including Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, etc. Why don't these jurisdictions and the societies over which they exercise legal power tend to politicize caste in the way that India, the United States, and the United Kingdom do? After all, the same grounds cited as the basis or evidence for the existence of the caste system, one might argue, on those same grounds, one might argue that large segments of Asia should also have had the caste system in place. For example, Thailand's legal past is said to be influenced a great deal by the Dharma Shastras, including the Manusmriti, the much maligned Manusmriti, which is also taken by anti-caste activists as a key document evidencing the caste system and its evils. So, for example, B.R. Ambedkar, who is regarded today as the champion of the Dalits of India and elsewhere, and who disagreed intensely with Mohandas K. Gandhi's support for the caste system, responded to Gandhi saying, "No one who knows anything about the Manusmriti can say that the caste system is a natural system. What does Manusmriti show? It shows that the caste system is a legal system maintained at the point of a bayonet." So bayonet is like a weapon, like a gun, right? So this was Ambedkar's view. The same Manusmriti is alleged by anti-caste academics as having had a lasting impact until today in the everyday lived experiences of Hindus. Well, if Manusmriti was indeed so influential in other Asian countries, such as Thailand, in the way that it is claimed for India, then one might have expected that the same sort of caste system to have arisen there also. But this kind of claim is not made for these countries, and nor are the fractious legal politics formed around caste visible there as have emerged in India, and lately in the United States and the United Kingdom. In the United States, the caste system has come up as a matter of debate with some consistency for the last few years, after Hindu parents and some Hindu organizations have raised objections to the portrayal of Hinduism in California school textbooks, and with somewhat less publicity elsewhere in the United States as well. Campaigners therefore seek to argue for and negotiate a better deal for Hinduism, including the portrayal of caste. The disputes are yet unsettled, but it is notable that academics have played a role in resisting the expectations of objectors that a fairer treatment be given to Hinduism, so that it is not as a matter of course associated with the oppressive caste system. The defense of Hinduism contains an ambiguity that is widespread among the defenders. They appear to accept that the caste system, with its discriminatory aspects, exists, but they do not wish for it to be highlighted in such a way as to give a completely negative image of Hinduism and the impression that there is no mobility which is present in it. In the UK, with which I'm chiefly concerned here today, the caste system generally remained below the surface in the period of significant South Asian settlement, gaining some academic notice and occasionally coming up in matters to do with school textbooks. However, the issue came up much more starkly from 2009 onwards with the proposal and eventual enactment of the legislative provision in Section 9 of the Equality Act of 2010, which empowered the government to make caste an aspect of race, thereby extending the Act's rules against discrimination to caste. This provision was reinforced in 2013 by an amendment replacing the power to make caste an aspect of race by a duty upon the government to do so. Despite the two parliamentary general elections since 2013, the UK government has not passed the required secondary legislation, right? So there is a sort of presumption in the legislation that secondary legislation has to be passed, but it hasn't been passed yet. So the current government, Conservative government, incidentally doesn't favor passing that secondary legislation. Meanwhile, the courts have sped ahead and decided in a leading case that the provision on ethnic group, which is already an aspect of race in the Equality Act, covers caste. The emergence of this case law, I'll talk about this in much more detail tomorrow, the emergence of this case law during the period of the controversy over the pending legislation has helped to muddy the waters somewhat. The government has identified the case law the government has identified the case law as having the potential to act as a backstop that would allow it to deflect demands for secondary implementing legislation, which the 2013 amendment requires. In March of 2017, so almost about a year ago, the UK government announced a consultation on the caste law. The consultation gave a choice to respondents between either retaining the case law or implementing the secondary legislation. So it allows only a choice as between the two options, and there is no third option to reject both the others. Because of the snap general election of 2017, the consultation deadline got extended to September of the same year, and the results are being awaited as we speak. Much of the intervening legislative history and the implications of the law on caste have been covered in previous writing by myself and some other people as well now. As has the fact that the courts have gone ahead and decided that the provision on ethnic group already covers caste. As I said, we will talk about this in much more detail tomorrow. For today, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the role played by UK Hindus in contesting the legislation on caste, and give an account of their limited objections to that law, and introduce some considerations that might give some form to their objections, and explain why their objections take the form that they do. Notions of the Indian caste system that are integral to conventional common sense ideas about the nature of Indian culture and society have already been mentioned. In our recent book, which I mentioned earlier on, The Western Foundations of the Caste System, we argue that the caste system is a Western construction. By this we mean that no caste system ever existed or exists in India. Are we okay? Yeah? No caste system ever existed or exists in India. That's our core argument.
Sorry for the interruption. You're saying that.
We are saying that in the book, yeah. And I'm saying that today here as well. So, but we're all okay, right? Nobody's fainted. That's good, yeah. Instead, the belief that such an entity exists is the outcome of and contoured by Protestant theological polemic about Indian religion that by the mid-19th century had settled into some sort of consensus. It was in the process of developing this polemic during the 19th century that also the idea of Hinduism, a caste-ridden and oppressive religion, first emerged among Protestant theologians and was later taken up by other writers and spread via the social sciences and various government laws, programs, and so on. To avoid ambiguity, the claim we make is that both Hinduism and the caste system were ideas formulated within Western culture. But these units do not describe any aspect of the social and cultural reality of India. They say nothing about the Indian traditions, but rather tell us about the Western culture that provides the background against which they were conceived. It is important to underline that these claims should not be confused with the constructivist claims made by others, for example, who say that the caste system may not have been present in pre-modern times, but came about as a result of colonial power-knowledge equation or something like that. This is an argument most closely associated with Nicholas Dirks of the University of California. Our position also allows a critical evaluation of claims made by all sides in the discussion on caste in the British context, especially given that they all accept some part of the claim about the existence of Hinduism and the caste system. So what I'm saying here is that even those people who oppose the legislation accept some idea of the caste system, and of course they accept the existence of Hinduism as well, which we say don't exist. To the extent that its members have an opinion on the matter, the conventional notions about the Indian caste system are entrenched and shared, as far as can be estimated, by a large section of British society. That can be viewed as part and parcel of the cultural hegemony that Orientalism holds over the West, which has been described so well by Edward Said. This extends to scholars, journalists, politicians, officials, and lawyers, so much so that that I came out as the only academic in the UK who happened to have opposed the law on caste. Wherever Indians have settled, including in Britain, they've taken the discrimination entailed by the caste system with them. So the story goes. It is such notions that help parliamentarians along with the job of adding the obligation to legislate to the Equality Act, as well as helping to push along the litigation leading to the mentioned case law. The same ideas go into helping to understand statements on caste made by the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which has informed the UK government of the requirement to legislate against caste discrimination after being lobbied by pro-legislation groups in the UK, including the the Equality and Human Rights Commission. This Equality and Human Rights Commission, if you like, is our national equalities body, as you have the National Minorities Commission in India and so on. In fact, you have several such bodies, so it's not the only one. The intermittent passing of resolutions against caste discrimination by the European Parliament is another example, with some prominent members of the European Parliament from Britain also campaigning for them. The notion of the hierarchical and oppressive caste system was also used as the basis for evaluating some 30 stories that allegedly testified to the prevalence of caste discrimination as found by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, whose report is the only official British study on caste discrimination. It was based on an investigation conducted only after the Equality Act 2010, with its caste provision, had already been passed. The group of academics commissioned by the UK's Equality and Human Rights Commission to examine the possibility of enacting legislation on caste discrimination was also composed of those already predisposed to supporting the legislation. Some among the team have also worked with church-backed NGOs to produce reports with stories of caste discrimination in Britain and arguing for the need to legislate against it. Perniciously, the trope of the caste system mobilized by campaigners for the UK caste law provides a ready-made explanation for how Indians act so that many an injustice can effortlessly be attributed to caste discrimination. Those who believe in it have little doubt that discrimination consequent to the caste system explains the way human interactions take place within Indian society. When the Equality Act 2010 was still a bill in Parliament, and the matter of inserting the caste provision was debated, the government pleaded for more time to conduct research. Lord Leicester, a veteran campaigner of the early British laws against racial discrimination in the UK, objected why any research on the prevalence of caste discrimination was even necessary. To him, it seemed obvious that the presence of Indians in Britain had to involve immoral practices of discrimination. What was there to research? In the attitude that this conveys, it is echoed in statements made by other parliamentarians who backed the call for legislation in the event that even one case of caste discrimination should arise. This is a departure from earlier anti-discrimination law statutes, which were passed after considerable evidence was gathered to support their need. So if you look at the legislation on sex equality or sexuality discrimination, religious discrimination, which have all been add-ons to the existing anti-discrimination law framework, you'll always find a great deal of research has been done initially to investigate the problem and therefore to justify the legislation in that light. But not so in the case of caste discrimination. In any case, what passed for research to justify ex post facto inserting caste into law also carries on this tradition of presupposing what remains yet to be proved about caste discrimination, including the very existence of the caste system. It would be unsurprising that our account of the Western construction of the caste system does not tally with even how Hindus generally think about caste. They have, like everybody else, been subjected to a generation or more of exposure to the idea that Hinduism is a religion that justifies caste discrimination. Those educated in India seem to have even less doubt, given the spread of politicization of caste, particularly since Indira Gandhi's time in power. Those of us who grew up in East Africa, and I'm one of those people, may not share the same flagellating reflex, as they have tended to be insulated from the fractiousness of caste identity politics as they have since developed in India, particularly since the 1970s. One only had to listen to the speeches of Baroness Srila Flather, who is an Indian origin member of the House of Lords, Lord Bhikkhu Parekh, same, and Lord Meghnad Desai, who is frequently on NDTV if you watch that. I understand not many people actually watch NDTV, although many Indians constantly complain about NDTV. But Lord Desai is also a representative of the British House of Lords who tends to be on that TV channel quite a lot. So you only have to listen to the speeches of these lordships and baronesses to notice how much this view of India and its diaspora has affected Indians. The only acceptable position for a Hindu to take today is to decry the sins of his ancestors and proclaim that he stands against any such oppression. After all, who wants to be for oppression? And this goes back to what Venkatji was saying about, the inability in institutions to even raise these kinds of issues. Neither can we underestimate resistance to questioning the received story of the caste system in academia. So here we go. Besides the mentioned academics who participated actively in the research for the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Lords Parekh and Desai both retired academics also supported the caste legislation. The editorial committee of the journal South Asia Research, based at the the South Asia Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London, objected when Emeritus Professor Werner Menski, who was actually here in 2012, I think, right, at our last conference, when Professor Werner Menski, who also happens to be the journal's chief editor of South Asia Research, wrote a lukewarm review of my book, my earlier book, Against Caste in British Law, in which I raised questions about the ill-founded nature of the justifications given for and the potential impact of the caste legislation. Otherwise unheard of in academic practice, members of the editorial committee insisted that the review may be published only on condition that a scholar who supports the legislation writes a rival review. That review was duly written by fellow academic Anpurna Wore, who, in her quest to justify the caste legislation, elsewhere accuses Indians of practicing apartheid. So according to, of course, to this apartheid account, it means that Indians had invented apartheid, because if the caste system is ages old, it wasn't really invented by the Boers of South Africa. It was actually an Indian invention. So we can take credit for that as well. One might be hard put to find any prominent Hindu organizations in Britain that is for legislating specifically on caste discrimination. Having said that, the leaders of many organizations have not been able to grasp the significance of rejecting the case law as well as the legislation, and have opted to retain the case law. For the leaders of some such bodies, including I'll mention some of these, they may not be familiar to you, but there's the Hindu Forum of Britain, the National Council of Hindu Temples, the BAPS Swaminarayan Sanstha, which probably is known to some of you, ISKCON, the International Society for the Krishna Consciousness, International Society for Krishna Consciousness, the Hindu Council of Birmingham. According to all of these, for them, supporting the case law seems to have been a conscious choice, because they are also working closely with the government to help realize the latter's desire to use the existing case law as a backstop to the demands for legislating. During the course of the consultation period, which I mentioned, started about a year ago, they have acted as agents of the government, instructing their members and whoever else would listen that the government's preferred option of the case law be supported. In effect, this means support for some type of law on caste and an endorsement of the pro-legislation lobbies' claims about caste discrimination in Britain. It would allow the Hindu organizations to claim victory, though somewhat disingenuously, for having helped to do away with the threat of legislation. The government, meanwhile, could claim electoral rewards, such as there may be, from Hindus for having avoided the prospect of legislating. I say such as there may be because if you look at the Hindu voting pattern in Britain, only about 25% of Hindus go out to vote, right? Compared to something like 70-80% of Muslims, for instance, right? This is in Britain. These political positions illustrate one facet of British multiculturalism, or what it does today, what British multiculturalism does today, i.e., it provides a framework through which governments attempt to accomplish the realization of policies through select and favored community organizations and media outlets. It is a facet of multiculturalism also in the sense that it encourages a type of identity politics, in this case, constituted around religious categories through which various organizations act as though they speak on behalf of a religious minority group. The leaders of these organizations are in turn rewarded with status-elevating invitations, honors, consultancies, and contracts. The questions of representation and who speaks for a particular group evidently loom large in this context. Although there are no contours for what would constitute any kind of answer, such representation questions can also be raised as a way of dislodging one group or representative in favor of another. In reality, group representatives may have little leverage over government policy and may play a brokerage role that yields a rise in personal status when they engaged in the public arena, ostensibly on behalf of identity groups. One of our most prominent British commentators on multiculturalism, British multiculturalism, is Tariq Maudud. He's an academic at the University of Bristol. has argued that British multiculturalism is a responsive system that accommodates the demands of various minority groups over time. But he fails to discuss the converse situation, whereby governments attempt to impose a policy or law over groups, achieving those aims through their active cooperation. It is this latter type of situation that appears truer of the way in which the dynamics around the caste law have been working. Hindu objections to the legislation have also allowed the government to avoid having to confront a wider opposition or to acknowledge a wider public impact. I'll say in passing that Muslim organizations have retained a total reticence on the issue of caste legislation, although Muslims are also likely defendants under the law or the proposed law. The Hindu reaction to the caste legislation is not only interesting in terms of the political and other expediencies that might inform them. What stands out in the defenses used by Hindu spokespersons is their attempts to prevent slurs on Hinduism by arguing that there is no sanction for caste discrimination in the scriptural tradition of Hinduism. Several layers need unpeeling here before we can get to appreciate the importance of their statements. Although the caste system is said to be a feature of Indian culture and society, it is associated with Hinduism. The way in which this may be done might vary in terms of detail across different accounts. So I'll just give you one scholarly account, just to keep things brief. Yeah. So here is a quote from a writer called Brockington, who has a book on Christianity and Hinduism. This is how he describes the caste system. The caste system, which is the most obvious and distinctive feature of Indian society, is intimately linked with Hinduism, and indeed is given a religious basis in the doctrine of karma. Whether intrinsically necessary or not, caste has traditionally been viewed as the basis of society in Hinduism, and Hindu legal texts have regularly laid down that it is a duty of the ruler to see to its proper ordering and maintenance. So this sort of is reminiscent of what I was saying earlier about the Dharma Shastras and Manusmriti and so on, right? How they are supposed to be foundational documents for sort of, constituting the caste system. I also have a much larger quote by Lord Harris, who is a former Anglican bishop, and he's one of the main proponents of the caste legislation in Britain. But I think I'll leave it out because it's rather long. But if you take say Brockington's account and Lord Harris's account together, right? One of the things that you notice most prominently is the association of Hinduism with caste, and that's not a surprise. I mean, this is pretty much standard account. Such statements that are made by Brockington and Lord Harris are hardly new. They can be traced back to the Protestant predecessors of Lord Harris, who from the late 18th century onwards began to increasingly identify Hinduism as the major Indian religion and connected it to the hierarchical and oppressive caste system. As Jacob de Roover, who's one of our colleagues who unfortunately couldn't be here with us today, has demonstrated, the outlines of the current accounts of the caste system and its association with Hinduism depend on ideas about Indian society and its social organization that had crystallized by the mid-19th century as a consequence of the settlement of certain Protestant ideas about the falsity of the religion of Hinduism, which in turn depended on their criticisms of Catholicism and Judaism. These allowed an explanation to take hold regarding the endurance of caste as an inherently discriminatory and oppressive social structure which, though immoral, had continued to function because the priests, i.e. the Brahmins, falsely gave it a religious clothing. However, neither contemporary anti-caste activists like Lord Harris and the rest of his colleagues in the House of Lords, nor the defenders of Hinduism, acknowledge such problems in their respective accounts. In fact, they share a belief in the existence of Hinduism and the existence of a discriminatory caste system. Where they differ is with respect to whether Hinduism sanctions caste discrimination. The defenders of Hinduism object to the association of Hinduism with the caste system, and it is this association in the statements by Lord Harris and others that triggers the responses of Hindus. Now, I've got a lot more material with respect to individual leaders of these organizations, which I've just cited, but I think I'll skip over because it might get a bit too much, right? Still, just to mention one or two points. While there is a long lineage of earlier Hindu responders to accusations about the caste system in Hinduism, we still need to figure out why and how, since the 19th century, these Hindus tended to view Varna as representative of some ideal order, and why they considered it relevant to defend Hinduism in those terms. It may be that they had accepted something of the accounts of those Orientalists from William Jones to Max Muller, who tended to view the Vedic past as ideal and glorious, which allowed them to develop a defense against accusations of the Hindu religious sanction for the oppressive caste system. This is suggested, for example, in how Nicholas Dirks connects Gandhi's defense to that of Max Muller's ideas about the degradation and corruption since the Vedic age. Whatever the precise dynamics involved, a couple of things can be identified at this stage. First of all, there is some kind of consistency in the way Hindus developed a way of defending their religion against accusations of the caste system, a way of defending Hinduism which continues to this day and is visible in the way the caste law in the UK is being discussed by them. Secondly, this defense involves an acceptance of both the idea that there is a Hindu religion or Hinduism and that there exists a caste system. What these defenders then try to do is to avoid the implication of a connection between them by denying that Hinduism sanctions the caste system. If there is any caste system sanctioned by Hinduism, it is a system of Varna or Varna Vyavastha, which is the ideal non-birth-based system based on merit and ability, and that there is no scriptural sanction for any form it might have taken since the degradation of that ideal. In so doing, it appears that Hindus are compelled to accept the premises of the Western construction of India and laterally of its diaspora. That is, they have to accept that they have a religion, which is Hinduism, and that a caste system exists. Thus far, they agree with their anti-caste opponents. Where Hindus try to secure some room for maneuver is by claiming that a degraded system is unconnected, or that such a degraded system is unconnected to their religion. In so arguing, however, they do not manage to meet the objections of those who claim that a discriminatory caste system exists, but rather talk past them by trying to save their religion from opprobrium. All such Hindus can do is to negotiate a better deal for themselves within Orientalism. In fact, they do not manage to defend against the legislation at all. All they manage to do is try to defend an entity, i.e. Hinduism, that fails to exist, against a claim about another, the caste system, that also doesn't exist. This is the tragedy of the post-colonial Hindu, who argues against chimerical allegations about the nature of his culture and society. It typifies what Professor Balagangadhara describes as colonial consciousness, because it provides an example of group whose members do not enjoy access to the Western culture that produced notions of the caste system and of Hinduism, while at the same time failing to have access to their own traditions. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for being so attentive. I know it was rather long.
So, two questions for Dr. Shah. Do the people who are alleged victims of discrimination in the United Kingdom form a significant vote bank? They do in India. We are very sure about that. They are a significant vote bank. They can change your political fortune. You may win or lose depending upon whether you are politically correct or not. It depends on what you say. That is one question. The second, are the people allegedly practicing discrimination preventing the so-called victims from emigrating to the United Kingdom so that they do not form a significant vote bank? See, the people who are so-called dominant, are they preventing these people who are the alleged victims from emigrating to the United Kingdom so that they don't form a significant vote bank? Have you done any study on this? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for the first of all for the observation, this insight, yeah, that you see in some people say in places like the United Kingdom, perhaps even the United States, you see, because they fear some kind of racial discrimination, what they do is they hide their actual name when they are submitting their CV for a job application or something like that, right? And some studies have, not surprisingly, proved that if you send identical CVs but in different names, then you will see some type of discrimination. You know, so you might not be shortlisted, or your CV will just be dumped in the dustbin or something like that. If you are considered to be of the wrong group category, right? Like, so a minority group or something like that. It seems that from what you are saying, Professor, that a similar type of thing is happening here, where people want to effectively hide their background for reasons that, for the understandable reasons that they feel that they're going to be discriminated against, or just told to shut up, or, you know, and discriminated against in all kinds of other ways, right? By their colleagues or whatever, seniors or something like that, right? So, but this is it's a new realization for me. I hadn't actually even understood that this was going on in India, right? To any extent. Perhaps we need to ask for more funding just to see to chase up this particular line of inquiry, which would be really interesting. Vote bank. Your question was about the vote bank, right? Are the people in favor of the legislation a significant vote back in the UK? The short answer is it's hard to tell, actually. Or an alternative answer could be no, or it's not proven, right, that there's a significant vote bank. Because as far as we know, there's a number of NGOs which have been pushing for this legislation. And we also know that a significant segment of not all of them, but a significant segment of these NGOs are basically linked to some kind of church organizations, right? And there's some orchestration also from outside the United Kingdom with, there's this International Dalit Solidarity Network, which receives a lot of funding from different church organizations in Europe and so on. And they also have a branch in the UK, which is one of the main sort of proponent NGOs, yeah, which is backing this or supporting this legislation. So, you see, this probably, as Indians, you are familiar with this, how very often policy in India, with respect to all kinds of things, right, like in terms of caste laws or family laws, right, is actually being made by NGOs. It's not being made by ordinary people, right, because the ordinary people are not doing research on this, they don't have the voice, they don't have the influence and so on. But some of the NGOs have a very powerful voice, and they have access to government circles, and they are very often even drafting laws. So that's a very interesting thing. And in the UK also, this kind of politics around caste is also being engineered by NGOs, effectively. But of course, they have significant backing by some powerful church organizations. And a key indicator of that is the fact that somebody like Lord Harris, who I mentioned, right? He's a former Anglican bishop who sits in the House of Lords by virtue of his position as a former bishop, right? So these guys also have some legislative power. And it's not only him, there's some other people from belonging to different church organizations who have some prominence. And so there is a kind of coordination, right? Now, if you ask the general Christian population of the United Kingdom, do you think that the law on caste would be a good idea? They might say yes. Yeah, the law on caste discrimination might be a good idea. But nobody is going to vote for you because you are passing a law on caste. Most of those Christians in the United Kingdom, they are not interested in that. Right? So that's why I think that the actual segment of the population which is asking for these laws is very slim. Now, the other thing is that there have been attempts to inflate the number. Right? For example, the leader of our opposition party, the Labour Party, who is a guy called Jeremy Corbyn, was also part of the all-parliamentary group on Dalits. We have a group on Dalits in the UK Parliament, right? Which is composed of parliamentarians. So obviously there are certain lobby groups and circles which have formed around that, right? Which have kind of resulted in a gathering of parliamentarians also, right? And through whom they talk and discuss these matters and so on. Now, Jeremy Corbyn in 2014 said that he thinks that there are 1 million Dalits in the UK. Now consider this, right? In the 2011 census, the count for Hindus was 800,000. The count for Sikhs was something like 300,000. Right? Now, even if you say there's an undercount, which there could be, like let's say how many you want Sikhs and Hindus together? How many do you think there should be? 1.5 million total. Out of those, Jeremy Corbyn, not only Jeremy Corbyn, Lord Harris as well, he is quoted in Parliament as having said that there are 1 million Dalits in the UK. So that means 2/3 out of every Hindu and Sikh is Dalit in the UK. Right? Where do they get these figures from? We have no idea. Right? So what they are trying to do is inflate this. Now, it could be a strategy of inflation because of vote bank considerations. Right? It could be. But I don't have any direct evidence to connect the two. You know, because very much like in the Indian context, our parliamentary system is also a constituency-based system, right? Or our electoral system is, so you get voted as part of, I don't know, what is it? Varanasi or Amethi or, you know, these kind of, I'm just citing some of the more famous ones, yeah? So because of that, so it depends on the number of votes in that place. Now, you may also know that let's say the South Asian population broadly, right, or the Indian population, in the UK is also concentrated in certain places, right, which means that there is a vote bank power. But first of all, we don't know whether the caste thing actually sways vote, right, even whether you're for or against. We haven't proven that the caste thing or your position on the caste legislation will actually sway the votes. We've been actually trying to intervene in elections as well. Right? So I'm playing that game myself. And we've been trying to mobilize the community to say, look, this guy, unless he supports our stand on caste discrimination legislation, don't vote for him. But to be honest, we don't know how successful that strategy has been. Right? Because we really don't know ultimately, you know, do people vote on taxes? Do they vote, you know, in the UK, the big issue is the National Health Service, things like that. Right? Their own economic future. They're not so bothered about a tiny piece of legislation on caste discrimination. That doesn't really bother most people, right? So again, it's a question mark, like, how does it translate into votes? Are there vote banks?
So, Dr. Shah, thank you for that wonderful discourse. My question to you is, would you say that caste-based discrimination by Hindus towards Hindus in the UK does not exist? And if it does exist, what do you think is the solution rather than caste-based laws?
Well, you know, increasingly, I'm beginning to question the place of discrimination laws in any society, broadly speaking, right? So, not just caste. I'm even talking about race-based discrimination and so on. You see, because there was a period of time when these things were very, very strongly advocated, and they seem to be the right thing to do. If you look at the American experience of the civil rights legislation, and actually we've been significantly influenced by that whole history, right, of needing to have anti-discrimination laws for, but then you see, at the end of the day, what's happening now? The Americans have already been through this, right? They have programs of affirmative action. So increasingly what's happening is that some type of underrepresentation is becoming sold as disadvantage. Disadvantage is being sold as discrimination, right? But actually, we don't know much about why certain types of people don't end up in certain positions. We just don't know, and nobody really studies that. So all of us, for example, there's an academic recently, she's written a blog article, but she's consistently researching on this issue about how black and minority ethnic academics and students suffer disadvantage in the university system, so we should have quotas. So can you imagine in the UK now, it's not just India, yeah? Even in the UK, they are now asking for quotas on the basis that there is merely an underrepresentation of some groups. And even which group we are talking about, it's not that clear. So if you're going to extend a quota, it's not really clear whether you're going to do it to black Caribbean people or all black people or this larger group of black and minority ethnic people. And actually, if you look at if you break down the black and minority ethnic, you look at the statistics with respect to people of Indian origin, they are outstripping everybody else, except the Chinese, right? And the similar statistics you'll be able to see in the, if you look at the American figures. So there are some racial minority groups, let's call them that, racial minority groups, which are, let's accept that there's discrimination. But somehow they are overcoming so many of these ostensible obstacles which are associated with discrimination to outstrip or outperform everybody else in the population. Now, how do you explain that? And should we have quotas for such people as well? Should we have discrimination legislation which speaks to the experience of those people as well? I'm not so sure. So, see, at the end of the day, a couple of things it boils down to. First of all, there's this jump, I think an unjustified jump to arguing for quotas now, everywhere. And so you can see the depth of
political correctness connected with the identity politics, which is now boils down to asking for quotas everywhere in the world, right? Not in the world, but in these Anglo-American jurisdictions, which are heavily infested with political correctness of this type of identity politics. And then you ask the question, to treat people nicely, now this goes back to what Venkatji was saying earlier on, right? To treat people well, to treat each other well, do we need to have legislation to treat each other properly as human beings? Do Indians need to have legislation to treat each other well? No, some people are saying, no, we don't. Yeah? So you just use your sense, right? Whatever sense you have. Like, so obviously every society in the world has some developed mechanism where there are certain notions of civility and coexistence and so on, right? Now, at a much more fundamental level, we need to ask the question, what is the place of legislation insofar as these kinds of human relations are concerned? Can you legislate against nastiness? Can you legislate against that? Because a lot of the arguments and legal claims that you see coming up in the court systems today are about people treating each other nastily. But is treating somebody nastily discrimination? And do we know why that this nasty treatment is occurring? Is it because of your race or caste group or something like that? Right? To be more specific to your question, actually the people who are arguing for the legislation haven't come up with convincing evidence, right? So the people on the defensive, like myself and the groups that I'm working with and a number of other people, are saying, look, these are all sort of trumped up things, right? They're made up. And tomorrow maybe we can go into the reasons why we think that the United Kingdom is also a proxy for much larger things that they want to achieve at the United Nations level and then rebound that onto India. This is the larger game that's going on, right? So the UK itself and whether or not caste discrimination exists in the UK is almost beside the point. That's not the point. Even the people who are proposing the legislation or the case law, which is going to be quite important now, it's irrelevant even to them whether discrimination exists. And you could argue that that's why they haven't put much effort in showing it, right? So I'll just leave it there for now. Is it okay? Yeah, it may be not entirely satisfactory, but yeah.